We began this week talking about the social constructionist approach to the study of human sexuality, in contrast to views of essentialists who looked at human sexuality as natural and biologically driven. Social constructionists look at human sexuality as not just natural, but also shaped by various social forces. If you recall, I stressed that this doesn't mean that social constructionists say sexual orientation is something that can be changed or learned, but rather that we need to consider the way in which social forces shape our understanding and views on sex and sexuality. In other words, we need to think about the fact that all of us are sexually socialized. So, when does sexual socialization begin? Well, sociologists argue it begins at birth. Families, friends, educational institutions, religions, laws, and the media all teach children not only what sex is, but also what it means, when one should have sex, with whom, and how. Oftentimes, children understand these messages about human sexuality long before they understand the practice of sexual interaction. Children are not only exposed, but also embedded in our cultural notions of sexuality and romance. See the image on the screen. I'm sure you've seen dozens of other images like this. And despite the innocence of these types of pictures, there are very clear sexual socializing messages embedded in this particular photograph. Yet, erotic orientation and sexuality are not closely linked in our culture with children or childhood. We frame children as asexual. We continue to define children as innocent, vulnerable, and in need of protection from adult sexual knowledge and practice. Taboos and tensions surrounding the language of discussing sexuality in childhood has made the study of children's sexuality and the process of early sexual socialization limited. It wasn't until around the 1980s that we began to get some research on child sexuality and sexual socialization. In 1986, sociologists Barry Thorne and Zella Lura published a cutting edge study on sexuality, gender, and children. Based on in school observation, the scholars found very few overt sexual behaviors among children. When they did see overt behaviors, they were mostly things like cross gender, public kissing, teasing, chasing, or laughter. What they did find was that children were very aware of what was sexual and that this was taboo, even if they weren't clear about the actual meaning. Some other interesting findings were that the sexual among elementary school aged children in this study was prescriptively ritualized and it was heterosexual. Kiss and chase games, for instance, were always among opposite sex children. In addition, they found that among groups of young boys, homophobic language was also used as a means of setting up a structure or hierarchy in terms of power. Girls engaged a little differently. The authors found that girls tended to engage in practices of constructing fantasies of romance and then sharing these as secrets with other girls. As children move from primary school to middle school, sexuality becomes more important to the children, and sexual socialization becomes more obvious, both to those being socialized and those doing the socialization. There's a multitude of studies on sexuality in adolescence, and in part it's because this is the time when children begin developing secondary sex characteristics during puberty. It's also a period when young people begin exploring sexual behavior and sexual concepts. About 1 in 5 teens has had sex before the age of 15, and therefore many researchers look at this phase of life as a rite of passage that has historically been of interest to researchers. Many studies focus on the demographics of teen sex, sexual knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. But more recently, we've seen an increase in research on young people, specifically adolescents, and their ideas about sexual identity. For many non heterosexual young people, this period of life is a time of stress, worry, and anxiety. However, the research has shown that access to other non heterosexual young people, for example, in LGBT youth centers or programs, can help non heterosexual young people go through the many sexual challenges, including coming out of the closet, that are part of being a marginalized group. Peer groups and the media, therefore, become increasingly important during this period of sexual socialization. Of course, society continues teaching us sexuality throughout our lives. Recently, there's been a large body of research on sexuality among the elderly. A survey of elderly people living in assisted care facilities found that elderly people want and have sexual and romantic interactions. In fact, in many places, this has become an issue because it's led to an increase in the spread of sexually transmitted infections. Older heterosexual couples are not worried about issues such as pregnancy, and therefore they often don't engage in safe sex practices. Thus, there's been an increase in requests for educational programs on sexual health for elderly people.